Memorial Day. Remembering those who gave their lives in the fight for freedom. To me, it's a very appropriate holiday, and it's one that we need to have reverence and respect. I feel a very strong sense of appreciation for those that I know who sacrificed their lives for me. So on this holiday weekend, I trust that you will remember those who fought for this country, for those who put their lives on the line in order for us to live freely as we do. But as with so many things right now, with where we are in our country, in the world, it's not going to be the same as it has been in the past, is it? We're not going to be having the family picnics. We're not going to be opening up the swimming pools. We're not going to be doing the things that we typically do because of the situation that we have. So it's going to be different. But the thing that's different for me, that probably saddens me more than anything, is the fact that we don't have the opportunity this morning to acknowledge our veterans in our service. We do not get to publicly say thank you for what you have done for us. So right now, I want to take time and just say thank you. Thank you. Thank you for what you did to protect our freedom. Thank you. It's 3 a.m. on a cold winter day, and patchy snow covers the landscape as loudspeakers overhead blare, telling everyone to get to their places. Surrounded by sandbags and concrete barriers, roughly 10,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines at Bagram Air Base has flipped a switch and turned from a deployed city in sleep to a sea of green and tan military awaiting further instructions. Some just woken from a few moments of sleep, others leaving their duties to attend more pressing concerns, and all focused on the events that are about to unfold. Down the 3-mile main road of this Afghanistan base, standing shoulder to shoulder, men and women in arms awaiting to pay their respects to fallen comrades. And soon, the lights of the emergency vehicles can be seen slowly making their way down the boulevard. Escort leading a flatbed trailer to an awaiting C-17 cargo plane on its way back to the United States. On the trailer, there are 3 caskets. All 3 are draped with the American flag. And as the trailer approaches, the lines of servicemen that are lining the streets each pay their respects by saluting sharply the men and women who have paid the ultimate price. And as the trailer reaches the plane, the formation's dismissed. Thousands of servicemen in the middle of the war zone, they were paying homage and respect the best way they know how. And folks, listen, similar ceremonies are played out in other parts of the world as well, all to show love and respect for the sacrifices and the dedicated duty our military service men and women show on a daily basis. Memorial Day. It's about remembering these fallen heroes, honoring their sacrifices. Sacrifices they made on your behalf and my behalf, so that we could have the freedoms that we have today. Folks, every conflict that we've been involved with has had its share of casualties. Think about it. Both sons and daughters have been lost. And it's often due to unusual bravery they displayed in the midst of combat. Every once in a while during those conflicts, something happens and a soldier does something which is so out of the ordinary, so extraordinary, that Congress acknowledges that. They acknowledge that person's efforts by awarding them a Medal of Honor. This award is presented to someone who distinguishes himself by risking his life above and beyond the call of duty. The deed performed must have been one of self-sacrifice, so conspicuous as to clearly distinguish the individual above his comrades, and must have involved the risk of life. And more often than not, these individuals They have sacrificed themselves for the greater good of those around them. One such individual, his name was Douglas Albert Monroe. The Medal of Honor was awarded to Petty Officer Monroe as a result of his actions on September 27th, 1942. Monroe was in charge of a group of 24 Higgins boats engaged in the evacuation of a battalion of Marines who were trapped by Japanese forces at Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. After making his preliminary plans for the evacuation of nearly 500 beleaguered Marines, Monroe, under constant fire by enemy machine guns on the island, and at great risk of life, he daringly led 5 of his small craft toward the shore. As he got close to the beach, he signaled the others to land. And then in order to draw the fire from them, he put his boat, the heavily loaded boats that he was trying to protect, he put his boat between them and the Japanese firing. And all he had was 2 small guns. But he was the shield between the beachhead and the Japanese. When the perilous task of the evacuation was nearly completed, Monroe was killed by enemy fire. But his crew, 2 of which were wounded, carried on until the last boat landed and cleared the beach. By his outstanding leadership, expert planning, and dauntless devotion to duty, he and his courageous comrades undoubtedly saved the lives of many hundreds of Marines. They would have perished had he not done what he did, and he gave his life for his country. You know, there's another such sacrifice that's happened that really I remember very clearly. A gentleman by the name of Pat Tillman. Some of you know that name. Pat Tillman was a football player. He played for the Arizona Cardinals. Pat was also on inactive duty. And so what happened when Afghanistan came about, he decided that he was going to get back to active duty. So he left his life of luxury as a professional football player, and he went back on duty. He joined the Special Forces, and he found himself in a battle in Afghanistan. And that's where Pat Tillman also gave his life for this country. Folks, listen, there are so many, many more stories, but the picture is clear. Many men and women have put their lives in extreme danger for their comrades in arms, and in some cases, they've given their lives in order that others could live. It seems that in every war, every battle, almost without exception, there are heroic actions that occur. Sometimes from individuals you'd least expect it. And I have no doubt that each time in the days and the weeks that followed, those for whom they sacrificed, for those whom they showed such unselfishness, they were inspired to fight even harder than they did before. They fought with greater zeal because someone paid the price for them. In a small town in a Middle Eastern country nearly 2,000 years ago, that's exactly what happened. See, a close look at this hero reveals some strong similarities to the heroes that I just described, but also there are some significant differences. Most of you know his name. His name was Jesus. He was a son of nobody, a carpenter named Joseph and Mary. He was raised in a podunk town, Nazareth. And the scriptures give us little to nothing about his early childhood except Christmas. We know the Christmas story and how the Magi came to visit. And then we don't know anything until he's about 12 years old. He gets left at the temple, and mom and dad get frantic, and they go back and find him. But that's all we know. And after that, we take a significant jump. We jump into his adult life and his ministry that's among his people, the Jews, but it's also to many, many Gentiles as well. But who would have expected such a heroic action from this guy? Listen, the prophet Isaiah tells us there's nothing about him physically which would have hinted at the possibility of any heroics. At least not like what we picture heroes to be. Superman, Batman, and the such. Right? That's not what we see. But like so many heroes of our present day, he, Jesus, gave himself. Just as these heroes that I mentioned put themselves in harm's way, Jesus put himself in harm's way. He endured pain and suffering for the benefit of others. Us. Isaiah 53. Thousands of years before Jesus says this. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that was brought us peace was upon him. And by his wounds we are healed. He did it willingly, as the heroes that we mentioned. But Isaiah continues on, he says this. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. See, Matthew records for us in his gospel, not once, but twice, where Jesus responded to the pain and suffering that he was about to endure. He said, Father, not my will, but yours be done. Just as in the case of Petty Officer Monroe, Jesus willingly endured this pain and suffering on behalf of his people to the point of death. Paul wrote this in Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, when he said, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And in Romans chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, we read this. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. But it's at this point where the comparisons stop. They begin to fall short. The men and women of the military, listen, they put their lives in danger, and they didn't do it for the sake of their fellow soldiers, but it's against other human beings. The battle that Jesus waged was against something far more powerful and far more devastating than just people. You see, the ultimate victory was not simply the taking of some important hilltop or the body of water or even in one country over another. But it was one that secured my very soul, your very soul. The victory over the power of the devil, the victory over the power of sin in our lives, the victory ultimately over death. And in that victory, the sacrifice made by Jesus, like Douglas Monroe, inspired those who witnessed it. Those who heard about it. In his first letter, Peter, who was one of Jesus' lieutenants, if you will, encouraged his readers with the lessons that he had learned from his commanding officer. 1 Peter 3:15, we read this. But in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Then later on in Peter's letter, and we find in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 these words when he encourages us. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kind of suffering. See, in the clearest and most dynamic example of how Christ's life, death, and resurrection inspired his people is very simply the fact that we, 2,000 years later, are still singing hymns. 2,000 years later, we're still praising God with our voices. 2,000 years later, we're sitting and worshiping God together. 2,000 years later, we're praying. We're lifting our hearts. We have our petitions. 2,000 years later, we're still encouraging each other in the faith. And yet, in spite of a wide assortment of issues that have created problems, the fact still remains America is still the best, well-equipped, and trained military in the world. The weaponry that we have, combined with the technology to use it, would make us seem quite invincible. Or so we feel. Until we find something very similar to September 11th, 2001, when the enemy decides to attack on our soil again. Folks, we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to admit that the world is full of terrorist attacks. We're not immune. Those individuals don't hesitate to give their lives for their particular cause or their particular belief. So listen, we will never be totally protected and totally invulnerable. Luke chapter 11 verses 10 to 12 says, nations will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes and famines and pestilence in various places and fearful events and great signs from heaven. Hello. Have you looked outside your window lately? I know we're quarantined. I know we're in the house. We're shut down. But have you looked out? That's where we are. It's happening today, and it is going to happen in the future. We know that. And it sounds like a bunch of doom and gloom until I go to Psalms chapter 34. Psalms chapter 34 just is very encouraging to me. In 34 verse 4 it says, I sought the Lord. He answered me. He delivered me from my fears. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? And I love it. Paul goes on with 2 Timothy 4:18. He says this, the Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. Listen, folks, as believers, as Christians, we fight a different type of war. We fight a different war than that of physical combat. Paul reminds us of this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. For though we live in a world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. And then I love, you move on to the letter to the Ephesians, and he gets more graphic and descriptive in what he says, and I love this. He says, how about the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness? Our feet are fitted with the gospel. We carry the shield of faith. We have the helmet of salvation, and we got the sword of the Spirit. We're prepared. We're ready. God has prepared us to be warriors in this world. I love that. That armor combined with a life of steady and regular prayer will indeed, it'll protect us from temptation, from evil that comes our way. And the key is, it ultimately preserves us for a life of eternal joy in heaven one day. There's a story told of a soldier who lived with that confidence in that eternal joy. He found himself in a heat of battle during the Korean War. And there was a man that was hurt badly on the battlefield of Heartbreak Ridge. And his buddies were in a foxhole about 50 yards away. This man was hit by sniper fire. It was an ambush. And as the fire continued, the other men that were in the foxhole discussed, what are we going to do? And yet they could hear their friend yelling very loudly. But the sniper fire was too intense for them to try to go out and get him. For a while, no one moved. And then the men in the foxhole could hear their wounded friend yelling for help. And one of the men in the foxhole just began to look at his watch, just real intently. Just looking at his watch. And the other guys noticed this, and they asked questions, but he just remained silent. And then all of a sudden, the man that was looking at his watch jumped up and went out of the foxhole. He crawled over to his wounded buddy, and then he grabbed him by the nape of the collar. Very slowly, he made it back to the foxhole, and neither one of them had any further or additional injury. Now, once the sniper fire had, I guess, died down a little bit, the man who saved his buddy was asked why he waited so long to crawl out after his wounded friend. This is how he responded. My mom said every day at the exact time she would be praying for me. And according to my watch, I left the foxhole exactly when she started praying. Folks, that is confidence in prayer. That is confidence in the joy that awaits. Now listen, we may not always receive answers to prayer in such a dramatic and dynamic fashion. And sometimes, even though our prayers may be involved that of physical protection or even sparing a life, they may seem to us to go unanswered. But we have God's promise that the ultimate victory in this world, the one that guarantees us eternity with Him, it's ours. But it only comes through Jesus Christ when we've accepted Him as Lord and Savior. Folks, as we go forth, I want to encourage you today to remember those who have served and made the sacrifice for our freedoms that we enjoy. I want to encourage you to do that. Celebrate that. Celebrate the remembering of those who have given their lives so that we can have these freedoms. But more importantly today, give thanks to God for Jesus Christ. Give thanks to God for His willingness to serve. Give thanks to God for His commitment to our spiritual freedom and our eternal salvation. And then be confident in your daily faith battles, knowing that you are equipped by God to be a faithful warrior that makes a difference in the world that's around you. Folks, the need for military force will more than likely never disappear. We will need a protectorate from the forces that come from around the globe. We need that protectorate to guarantee the rights and privileges that we express and we have today. It is through the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the Marines that we have the luxury of unprecedented freedoms in this world. But only Jesus can grant us the freedom from sin that His sacrifice has given us. The freedom from sin, the freedom from death, because of the cross that He endured for you and I. The ultimate soldier was Jesus.